What is up, PartnerUp? I finally got to say that instead of Jared, because Jared unfortunately is not here today, but I'm really excited to have Alex Komoroske joining us. This is going to be kind of a wild down the rabbit hole sort of conversation. Before we get into it, I got to mention we have a really exciting event coming up August 5th. So it'll be Friday, August 5th, 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern. It's the kickoff of a series, First Fridays. The first Friday of every month, we're going to be doing events, and this one is with Keyflow, and it's about how small partner programs can land big partners going to get in the big fish. And we're going to have some really cool sessions. We're going to actually do a live recording of the PartnerUp podcast there, have some great stories and conversations about people with very young partner programs, or sometimes if you're the only partnerships person at your company, how to break in, how to go and find partners that normally you would think are out of your reach. So check it out. You can go to the Partner Hacker homepage to get some more info. Okay, today I'm super geeking out about this conversation. So Alex Komoroske, he's been a product lead at some of the biggest and best companies in tech. I mean, Google, Stripe, et cetera, like you name it. He's also a contributor to the Flux Collective, which is a very, very fascinating email newsletter that I've been reading for actually since you told me about it, Alex. But I want to ask you a question about what you are, because I sense there's something that's going to be different than like titles you would find on LinkedIn. Okay, so I don't remember where I first heard this question, but I love it. If someone shook you awake at night and said, "What are you? What do you do?" What's your instinctive response?
I'm a systems guy, I guess. I see this like the sort of systemic levers in any like human system, and like instinctively know how and where to like pull them to get the right thing to happen, I guess. But I don't know. I feel like I'm as time has gone on, I've gotten less and less sure of the answer, and it's more and more like, "Hi, I'm Alex. I don't know. I'm like, and I've changed over the years. You can see the glimmers of it from earlier, but I don't know. I'm me. I'm me, and I'm a kind of a weird, quirky, out there perspective that approaches problems in a way that like doesn't really fit in a lot of boxes. And I kind of gave up trying to fit in boxes on it a few years ago.
So at the cocktail party, when someone's like, "So what do you do?" You have that sort of, how weird do you want to get?
Yeah, how weird, exactly. I can get really deep where to say things that you're like, "Are you tripping or something right now?" But like, I think that there's generally, I guess my rule of thumb is I like to be a kind of positive irritant in systems, uniformly positive energy and collaborative energy, almost to tickle systems strategically in the right place to help them kind of see maybe they might go in a slightly different direction that might end up becoming a much better long-term direction.
What's fascinating is it's easy to hear that and be like, okay, so this is someone who likes to kind of sit up in the ivory tower and just play around with ideas, which there's nothing wrong with that.
I like doing that too. Yeah, okay.
But you would assume, okay, so what is that? What is that? How does that actually affect a company's bottom line? How is it that you're working at these companies doing actual stuff in the real world where you have deadlines and goals and quotas and revenue targets and products that have to be delivered? That's what I find really fascinating. You seem to dwell in two worlds. You seem to have done a phenomenal job of mapping your sort of abstract insights onto actual tactical stuff in the real world.
And the reason I think it has been, it's worked at least in some contexts, is because it's actually backwards. I take my intuitive understanding from hands-on experience and mentorship, which helps you hone your own, absorb lots of interesting other experiences from other people that you're mentoring, and also hone your own intuition into words. And then later it kind of levels up into like, oh my God, wait a second, here's a broader pattern that applies in a lot of other places. So I don't start with the abstraction. I kind of start with this intuitive hands-on experience that I've been feeding lots of information and lots of perspectives and lots of weird signal for years and years and years, because I like it and it's fun. And then later also that allows you to see these patterns pop out. I think if you start with abstraction and then try, okay, cool, now how we're going to apply this to the world is like almost certainly not. Like you have to have some kind of connection to the hands-on experience. And that's why I'm really glad in retrospect, my first 13 years of my career were product management. And you're an operator. You're like kind of a mini CEO of a space, and you're responsible for it holistically. And that requires you to, and you're tied into this thing. It's like you are sensing everything your product senses, all the political threats internally, all of the like possibilities, all of the like downside risks if you mess something up. And it's like being plugged into the matrix, in that you're like, whoa, you're absorbing all this extra information and intuition about what things work and what things matter. But the downside is if you make a mistake, like, and that project dies, you kind of die a little bit too. Like, you lose some credibility. You might have to, not get the promotion, or maybe not even be able to work at the company anymore. And so there's like this trade-off of, it's really extremely powerful, high signal information, but it also is like, the reason that you're learning a lot is it's a little bit scary. You're a little bit out there doing.
I love the way you said that you're like wired into the matrix. I remember, I think it was Ben Horowitz I heard one time say that when you have a company, it's like literally wired into your nervous system. And I experienced that firsthand in a brutal way with my previous company. It was like when we were just not succeeding. It's like this building a product as well. If you're not getting what you're trying to get, and you're trying to figure out why, and you haven't figured it out yet, like, I'm not kidding, Alex, my physical health, I literally like almost died. I had like crazy, like hyperthyroid. I ended up in the ER. And it was like, as soon as I just said, okay, this failed, it was like my whole body just was relaxed again and everything.
Yeah. I think we don't, as an industry, as the broader tech industry, we really rely on heroics a lot. We put heroics up on a pedestal, and heroics is always better. And some people are just more heroic and they can just do more. And like, okay, fine. But it also means the human and emotional cost on people is real. And I realized, I used to work on a Chrome web platform. I cared very deeply about morally, about doing the right thing for the open web holistically. I used to say my allegiance is to the open web, then Chrome, then Google, in that order. And that means I was so passionate about it, but it means you take the world on your shoulders, and every little setback is crushing emotionally to you and to your person. And I think there's something, I think Fred Kaufman or a few others call it as like, think of work as a game. Think of it as a thing that's really important, a game that matters, and you want to get better at it and have more impact because that helps the world. But also it's separate from you. It is not you. It is a thing that, like, it can fail, and you can say, cool, I am still as myself. I'm still here. And like that's a bummer. I learned a lot. I'm proud of the decisions and actions I took in that experience, but holding it a little bit at arm's length.
It's funny. Have you ever heard of Finite and Infinite Games by James?
100. Yes. Yeah. Love it. Yes. Okay. Love it.
That made me think of that as well. Like that. And this gets us into some of the stuff we're going to jump into, that frame or that lens, being able to apply that and say, okay, I need to just change the way I'm looking at this. The challenge is, as you mentioned, your way of generating these kind of abstract insights and pattern recognition that can apply and give you a lot of good strategies and ideas, comes from close connection to an ability to observe what you're experiencing, what you're going through with your product, just with your life in general. And so like that level of close connection of being wired in, it provides you all the inputs necessary to form these more abstract models that are generally applicable, but it also can kill you if you don't create that distance. Like, I am wired into my company, but I am not my company or my product or my job. And that can be a very difficult game to navigate.
You want to have an infinite mindset. You want to have this open, generative kind of like, we're doing it for its own sake. It's a really powerfully positive perspective, but you live in a finite world. And the reality is you got to pay your bills, rent or mortgage or whatever. And so my rule of thumb generally is 1, stay alive. Make sure the product, get to product market fit. And I mean that for your product, for your career, make sure that if people ask, they go, you want to minimize the number of people who go, why does that product exist? Why is that person employed here? You want to minimize the number of people who say that. That's your lower bound. And this is not like, and then this is your survivability. Now, once you survive, you now are in a position where your runway is longer, because by default, you will survive because people think that you are adding value and doing a useful thing where your product is. And from there, you can now take an infinite mindset where you start saying, oh, our runway is effectively infinitely long. I can be placing small bets. I can be doing things that have indirect value. One of the things that happens in modern tech we are so like, we're like very high modernist. We're very focused on measurability. And of course if you can't measure it, it doesn't matter. It's like, what? Like, I mean, I get that where you can measure it, it's better to measure. But first of all, if when you measure something, it will corrupt the underlying things. Is Goodhart's law. And it's a fundamental characteristic of anytime there's scarcity and a metric that is used to handle in a,
what's the old analogy from or the story from the Soviet Union, the nail factory, right? Where they're like,
yeah.
okay, you're going to be judged on how many nails you produce. So they start making tiny, tiny, tiny nails. And they're like, all right, fine. You're going to be judged on the weight of the
Yeah.
nails you produce. And then they make, giant railroad spikes.
Yeah, and so you're gonna like, this is a fundamental characteristic. It will never not be there. It will be there in every system. If you have a scarcity administered by a metric, the metric will be gamed. Period. End of story. Like that is the fundamental law of the universe. One of them. So you have this. But so people look at these things that are measurable. Like, let's imagine that the number of problems that are measurable, like you can see the direct causal factor, you can administer it and instrument it in a way that you can measure it, is like maybe 1/10, 1/100th of the interesting leverage points. The vast majority of value in systems comes from the indirect effects, the ripple effects of small things that compound in nonlinear ways with other things, like, hey, being a nice person and helping make your team feel supported and like they're part of something that matters and that they matter and that they feel seen. They're like, well, what business metric does that change? Well, I mean, first of all, in the long haul, it actually does affect business metrics. It's just I can't prove it to you directly ever. I can never draw a direct line to it, but I can tell you it's really important. And so I think a lot of people are like, well, I'm going to focus on directly measurable stuff. It's like the streetlight fallacy. Some drunk loses his keys and he's looking for him and he's looking underneath the street light and someone says, oh, do you think you lost them over here? It's like, no, I have no idea, but this is where I can see easily. So like I'm searching here. And we do the same thing in the industry of like, we're focusing on these things that like have direct measurability and causality, which is a tiny fraction of the ways to add indirect value. And yes, if you don't know if you're going to survive 6 months from now, then sure, you got to get to PMF. You got to get to the point where you are actually a sustainable business, sustainable project, sustainable as an individual in a larger organization. But then do the indirect stuff,
So I got to add, this is great because I have a feeling this is music to the ears of our listeners, most of whom are working in partnerships. So something that is very, very common in the partnerships world is like, look, our job is to create partner value, whether that's for, integration partners, service partners, whatever. You're trying to create value for your partners, which is like this very indirect way of knowing, hey, it's going to come back to us, so to speak, right? You treat them well, they're going to want to work with you. That's going to grow your ecosystem. It's going to impact your bottom line, but it can be very, very hard to measure. So partnerships are kind of like by nature, and partnerships, not just as a department, even as like an approach, like an approach to marketing or sales or customers, partnering with other companies and individuals in your ecosystem. People who, they hear this and we're talking about it all the time and they're like, yes, I agree. How do I sell that to my boss, to my manager, right? And so what have you found the ability to say, hey, look, there's a lot of stuff that can't be measured that still matters. How do you make that sales pitch? How do you convince leadership to give you the rope?
Honestly, it's really hard. And the answer that I found is two things. One, I make sure I earn credibility by adding direct value and people see that I don't like that I am authentic, that I will apply rigor to what I work on, and I'll focus on making sure the right thing happens from the broadest possible perspective. And that everybody I interact with, I try to have them come away with that. So you earn the credibility to get the benefit of the doubt and say, I cannot prove this thing to you, but I do think this is going to maximize the value. You're going to take a little bit of a risk. And so I need to have that credibility in the first place. The second thing, honestly, the part in my career where I got 10x what I believe to be my broader impact was when I stopped trying to get promoted. And I just said, you know what? I'm okay never getting promoted ever again. I achieved director which was, a long slog, and like, I did it. Yay. And like, cool. I don't care to ever be promoted ever again in my life. Not because people who know me, like, it's not because like, oh, I'm just taking it easy. I kind of have a hard time taking it easy. I get so spun up with creative ideas and talking to interesting people and connecting up interesting people. And that was when it started being like, oh, I can just focus on indirect value. I don't have to focus, like every perf review system, every single one People are like, oh man, we finally fixed the problem in our perf system at our company. No, you didn't. Of course you didn't. Because again, it's scarce rewards with directly measurable things. You will get Goodhart's law. There is no way to fix this. Like, it's fundamentally impossible to, because like, how do you differentiate between somebody who says they're adding indirect value and somebody who actually is? It's really hard to do it in any direct way. You can't run the counterfactuals. And so it becomes down to this kind of like, I don't know, but like, I really would want to work with that person again because I feel like they're a multiplier, a force multiplier on the outcomes. I just say, like, you know what? I don't care to be eligible to a perf system anymore. That's okay. I'm just Alex. Hi. I'm not going to fit inside that box. I'm going to try to be the best version of me specifically.
Yeah, it's funny. There's that like it's almost like we all already know the answer, right? It's like, what's the old like Supreme Court justice of the definition of pornography?
Yeah,
when I see it, right?
Yeah.
We all kind of know. It's like, okay, well, how do you measure all this indirect value? If you really just sit back, there are people you work with where you just know we want that person on our team.
Yeah.
We know they're creating value.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can't put it in bullets is frustrating, but I think that's kind of part of your work. And I want to get into a couple of the things that you've put together that are so fascinating. Your work almost reminds me of the famous quote by F.A. Hayek, which is that the curious task of economics is to reveal to people how little they know about what they imagine they can design. Right.
I love that.
And you're kind of like reminding everybody that all businesses, all products involve humans. And that's a big problem if you're trying to make it map perfectly. Right. So this is how we got you on the show. Originally, Jared came across this gardening platforms. It's kind of like a flip book deck presentation thing.
It's a big, overwhelming. Like if it were printed out, it would go thunk on your desk. I think when it's a lot.
It's incredible. It's incredible. So it sparked this conversation because we're always talking about kind of an ecosystems approach for companies, and that like, hey, direct sales and marketing channels are getting weaker. And those who kind of recognize that their customers they're not this metaphor of a funnel does not really match reality. That's not the way that people are experiencing the discovery and purchase of products and all these things. And so Jared and I love to kind of play around with these metaphors and ecological metaphors. And I think when we came across your deck, it's really cool because you have a way of doing that, but connecting it to the day-to-day. In fact, you say in the deck, I'm going to quote you here. We'll focus on idealized abstractions to see the big picture dynamics better. Rest assured, all of this is based on more than a decade of experience designing and maintaining various real-world platforms. Abstractions work best when connected with your own practical experience. Instead of free-floating concepts, you can recognize concrete examples from your own experience that fit in. That kind of ties to what you said before. This is sort of like a bottoms-up approach of like practice first and then theorize about what you practiced. That's sort right. of the genesis?
Yeah. And also, honestly, that's just one of the rules of thumb. You always want expectations to be low and then blow them out of the effing water kind of. And so generally I've learned some people love the conceptual stuff and are super into it. And some people are like, what is this? Like, I don't understand. And so like, that is partially like, hey, if you don't understand, that's fine. That's okay. It doesn't have to, and I'm deliberately not going to connect this up too concretely to like, I'm thinking for each of these things, I'm thinking of like 20 examples from my real experience or indirect experience or kind of examples I'm aware of. I find examples are often really, in systemic problems, they're often, people are like, oh, just give me an example. Well, now you're going to cling to this particular example and you're going to take away the wrong thing. Because any specific example, you look at it and say, oh, well, actually, here's the causal factor. This person was an idiot. Right here, this one, they made the wrong call. It's like, oh, okay. In retrospect, armchair quarterbacking, fine. Maybe they made a mistake, but like, here's another one. In this case, like this product market fit was very clearly like, we should have seen this in the UX. It's like, okay, fine. Again, armchair quarterbacking after the fact. It's this large scale thing. You cannot create an intuition for a large scale systemic effect via an enumeration of concrete examples. It is not possible, in my opinion. You need to do something that abstracts out the broader principles to see it more clearly.
As you were describing that, I immediately thought of arguments I'll have with my kids sometimes where it's like, hey, you need to work on having a better attitude about this or treating your sibling nicer. And they'd be like, give me an example. And then it turns into a court case immediately.
Yeah, and they lawyer like, well, that one, and actually she pinched me first or whatever. Like, and so it's kind of I find it uninteresting, and I find it it's like such a classic thing. It's so easy to say, well, that sounds really abstract. And what they mean is that sounds like bullshit and that sounds overly academic, especially in the tech industry. That sounds very abstract is absolutely like throwing shade on the like the applicability of the idea for sure. And it sounds so reasonable. I believe in like concrete examples. Can you give me a concrete example of that? Yes, I can give you 1,000. How much time do you have? Like so I just find it to be uh, I get frustrated with that frame, but that shows up a lot of places. That's one of the reasons that slide is in there, is to like proactively defend it. Like, I know that I'm being very abstract and like
Yep.
deal with it. Like,
Yep.
you know, so
this presentation opens up that it's about platforms, gardening platforms. And the first couple slides here, a lot of people treat platforms like sleek, modern skyscrapers and gets frustrated when nothing goes to plan. If you see them more like a garden, everything becomes easier. And then you say, well, what is a platform? People think of them as code, but it really means any kind of shared infrastructure. Infrastructure, things that are pre-existing that any user or can take for granted and build upon. It includes code, but also processes, documentation, know-how, marketing. It's this sort of, it's like, hey, you're working with something that extends beyond the bounds of what you can directly control, but you have to acknowledge that it's there. And again, you get into ecosystem, the sort of the platform being nested in a broader ecosystem. How do you, because it's easy, I think, to kind of get, this is like the classic kind of like what can happen to some economists and why they don't become entrepreneurs, right? Like, okay, well, now that we recognize we're in this complex interdependent market, to just be like, the market will take care of it, right? Like, oh, well, we'll just let our community, we'll just put this out there and hope that the ecosystem does the rest. How do you avoid going too far in that direction?
So I firmly believe that basically everything of any import that has ever happened in society or the physical world is a set of adjacent possible things that are actually viable ideas that are then put in place from the adjacent possible and then now become a stepping stone onto something else. And so like when people are like, oh, let's have a big bold bet. I hate big bold bets. I want to see a constantly stretching the adjacent possible for viable ideas and then building up into something much, much larger. So if someone says, I'm going to have this great ecosystem, it's going to have, all these different parties, all these things. It's like, neat. The only proof that that idea works is the existence of such an ecosystem behaving as you describe. I can point out very often ahead of times why is extremely unlikely a given ecosystem frame will work. Hey, you're doing value capture at every layer of the stack and you have all the benefit is theoretical if you had a network effect going and you don't have that yet. So like this almost certainly is not going to work.
You're describing every B2C pitch deck.
It drives me absolutely wild when people do platforms like, we don't know where we're going to monetize it in the stack. So we'll reserve optionality at every layer in the stack. And it's like, okay, but now this means what you're telling people is, hey, I have nothing to give you right now, but if this becomes successful, I will be able to give you incremental traffic at some unknown amount, conversion rate or whatever. Oh, and by the way, if that happens, I own you basically, because I could do anything I want at any of these layers. And it's like, why would anybody do that? Like, I don't understand how you get that thing started. So, so you have to have a viable, that's why I look for little itty bitty seed crystals of things, like patterns of usage and behavior, little flames that you can start from. And so like in an ecosystem, you do something super duper simple. You make it so that there's like a place to a message board or something. And then when you see somebody come in and start asking questions, you fan the flames and you answer their question in that space and you make sure it looks like a very active place. And, there's lots of tricks for this. So in your message board, what you do is things come in, you want to make sure it looks alive. You don't want anyone to look at it and go, is this actually still is this product still working? Is anyone actually going to respond to this? You want people to look at it and think, this community is alive. This community is thriving. And so then what you want to do is make sure it's not just, you responding to everything. Ideally, you want other people to be responding to it. So what you'll do is if someone asks you a question directly, you say, hey, that's a great question. Can you do me a favor? Can you ask it on the public message board? And then nobody knows that you did that behind the scenes. All they see is this person proactively went out and did this thing. I guess this is the kind of place where people just proactively ask questions, no matter how silly they might sound. And then you answer it there. And now other people see, oh, and it's the kind of place that people will answer. And then what happens at a certain point, once the community gets going, you want somebody else from the community who doesn't work for you to answer the question for them. That is gold when that happens, because it shows the community is thriving. People care enough to come here and actually do some work to help other people in the community, which shows extraordinary motivation and shows that you have something very, very real happening in your ecosystem.
What's your take on, because we've had this debate on whether if you have a community is a big part of what you're trying to build. When you first launch something, product, a company, should you find an existing community that you try to infiltrate, so to speak, tap into, or ecosystem, or should you try to build your own? And this kind of like this, this sort of ongoing debate. Like on the one hand, it seems like there are downsides to trying to like enter an existing ecosystem or a community. Obviously you can come across as a mercenary, or you can a lot of ways to do it wrong, or you can just not have control over the direction. But building from scratch, I don't know, it just seems like a fool's errand. It feels like community is something that has to emerge organically.
And so one way of looking at this is every single community and every single like thriving system has grown out of a previously thriving system. It's not possible. Everything everywhere has grown out of the same life force from back to the first organism and before indirectly. So you can borrow like this community is a raging bonfire and it's awesome. And like a little spark goes out over here, and then that starts to grow something larger. So every single community, all the way back to the beginning of time, can be traced back. So like there's no new community. You have to have somebody who has a existing motivation or energy, and you're looking for not so much to steal it because it's a positive sum thing. You creates more energy and motivation when it starts going. So you're looking for people in communities of like, oh wow, these people have a problem that they really want this particular thing solved. I can help solve that problem. I'm gonna go talk to them. I'm going to say, and you like generally my rule of thumb is you should know you should know you have 3 concrete customers banging down the door saying, when can I use your thing? I need it right now. And that demonstrates extremely clear motivation. And that's your starting point. And then from there at your seed, your spark. And then from there, you can grow that into a community. Another rule of thumb is if you have customers crawling through broken glass to do a thing, that is a thing that you would like to, that they're glad that they are doing. That's a really great sign that you have a product market fit, and almost certainly an easy thing to do to grow your market share is to reduce the amount of broken glass to crawl through, because there's almost certainly other people right next to them who do not have quite as high of a pain tolerance. So you lower the bar of pain tolerance required, and you'll almost certainly unlock adjacent demand. Now the question is that enough to have a plausible enough, to support your valuation, your intended size and scope of your opportunity? That's another question, but.
So in your your deck here, I always want to call it a deck, but I don't know what else to call it. On platforms, there's this idea that like, hey, a platform is something that a lot of other people can build on top of, and you sort of go through the pros and cons of, hey, if other people build on top of it, that's good. Of course, you can lose control if they sort of have the entire top layer, so to speak, or if one party does. What's interesting is like everyone wants to, or at least they give lip service to wanting to be a platform. But if everyone's a platform, then no one's building on top of a platform. When you think about company strategy or product strategy, when do you say, hey, we're perfectly happy building on top of an existing platform and we can build a thriving business this way, versus no, we need to now move down the stack and become the platform ourselves?
So first of all, I don't think everybody agrees with the platform framing. I think it's a common frame that people use in like VC pitches and stuff. I think in practice, most organizations do not like it. In fact, I got in some of my previous lives as a product manager, I honestly just got to the point of like, I didn't even try to make a platform argument. I just created the conditions where a platform would emerge and go, oh my God, what luck. Like this thing is showing up,
What's the resistance to the platform?
The rule of thumb I'd say is, it's very easy to add negative energy to the idea to say, I don't know if anyone wants that. What are the use cases? And this is another thing I hate when people say, what's the killer use case for your platform? The entire point of having a platform is that you don't need to know the killer use case. If you knew the killer use case, you would just build that thing and charge a premium for it. So the entire point is that you go from one thing that you build being the way that you extract value to anything that anyone builds, you get some value out of, and you have a symbiotic relationship. That is a game-changingly different thing. It is fundamentally different. People will ask, I believe it to be fundamentally impossible to make a platform argument from concrete examples. I think it requires an abstract argument, and some people just won't go there. They just won't agree, and they'll say, I'll say another thing that happens a lot in ecosystems. They go, well, what if somebody does a thing that we don't like in our ecosystem? Ecosystems are messy. That's the point. The mess is the magic. It's where all of the energy comes from to do interesting things that you didn't think about. That's the entire point. So people say, I want an ecosystem, I don't want it to be messy. It will definitely be messy. Now you can do things to hide the mess from your end users, but you fundamentally do have to have it be messy. Otherwise, it's not. It's like its potential energy isn't very high.
Yeah, you talk about this concept of increasing your luck surface, and sort of the whole platform idea is, hey, I know because I've observed it, and I also have observed patterns that tell me that there's more of this, that there's people out there with problems to solve and things that are like, you know, somewhat partially legible. I kind of know they're there, but I don't know exactly in what way. So like if we can build this, increase our luck service, build this broader platform, and then we get to observe how users behave, there's an obvious beauty to that. And there's so many examples of that working. There is also plenty of basically, I don't have a product. I don't even have a problem to solve. I'm just going to put out some stuff and then just like hope that, product-led growth becomes, I put out stuff and then I hope that people start using it in ways and find a use case. And that's kind of more like on the fringes of like maybe what would move out of being an actual business, but be more like open source communities and experimental things, which are very needed. But when it comes to like a business, what are some of the guardrails you put on when you're sort of like trying to create space for these platforms to evolve and emerge? Where are the places that you say, okay, we got to rein it in at some point?
When you do the luck surface area move, you have to be able to survive for a long time. You have to have effectively infinite runway. So if you don't yet have product market fit for your product, I'm using product also a team within an organization where people are like, why don't we have that team again? Like then you don't have product market fit. Then your horizon is your runway is short, and so this method only works if you will survive for long enough. If you will survive for long enough, you can plant some of these seeds so you have exposure to, if an ecosystem starts showing up, you can start moving. But if it doesn't, like what's one of the cool things about seeds? You can plant a seed can sit there for 1,000 years sometimes and then grow when the conditions are right. That's awesome. So like if you need to, I need to go right now, or otherwise we're going to go bust. Like, ooh, probably you did the wrong business model then, because like you didn't start from concrete enough demand, so you can't do the luck surface area thing unless you'll survive for a long time.
Yeah. It's interesting. We recently, a previous episode, I think it was just the last episode, we're talking with the CEO of Impact, which is it's a platform it started as a platform just to manage affiliate marketers, right? So if you have a bunch of affiliate, marketers that you're connected with, you can manage your whole process there. And they just started to notice all of these companies and brands were using it in all these different ways. They weren't just partnering with normal affiliates. They were doing all these weird, bizarre partnership types that they had never, and they for a while, they just let them do it, and they just called them non-traditional sort of use cases. And they're just like, whatever, they go in this bucket, fine. And eventually those became like such a large part. They became like almost bigger than the sort of traditional. And they're like, okay, maybe they're the ones that are doing the normal thing, and we're just calling it non-traditional, right? They were almost like forced to broaden their platform, but that's because they had already nailed one. They had product market fit in one relatively tight area, and that kind of gave them the permission to say, okay, now let's go crazy. How broad can we get? What can we do here now that we've got something that pays the bills?
Yeah, exactly. That totally tracks. Is like, yeah, we built a product that is good enough on its own to at least keep on going, and like it's bringing in enough money to like extend our runway for longer. And now we have this positive exposure. And sometimes what happens is people use your ecosystem, and you're like, well, wait a second, they're doing this thing that like completely goes against their entire business model, and like if they use that, then like we don't exist anymore. And it kind of, so you can get stuck in some of these situations where you don't. So ideally, what you want is the ecosystem do like surprising things that you're like, that's kind of cool, or like, I'm okay with that. Like that's but when you have that, compounding growth dominates linear growth over time. It will crowd out linear growth near it, like fundamentally. So people do this thing where they're like, well, this thing is going to grow at linear rates like this, and this is going to grow at linear rates like this. How's your thing going to do? If there is a compounding loop, which ecosystems do have a compounding loop, and it works, then it will dominate the other ones. End of story. Like you don't need to go, oh, it's going to be 23.2 and 25.8. Like you don't know, but you do know that the compounding growth will dominate the linear growth nearby it if it does become compounding growth.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious, Alex, your thoughts on, because we've been talking primarily about sort of the architecture or the infrastructure of a platform, of an ecosystem, or of a community. I'm curious your thoughts on like what might be called the brand, or maybe just we say reputation, because when I think about thriving ecosystems, I mean, even take programming languages. Because we're dealing with humans care about status. They care about belonging. They care about being cool. And so when you look and you're like, okay, what am I going to, what language am I going to use to build this thing? Well, I love this community over here. They're really cool. I like going to their conferences. I like hanging out. This community, even if the code is better, if it works better for this use, they're kind of like not cool, right? And that plays a role. And same with companies. Like certain companies just have an aura. People just want to be around them. They want to be a part of their ecosystem. They want to brag about it, right? And like, how can you be deliberate about that? Like because that's where you often this is where marketers will catch shit for being too vague and abstract, right? They'll be like, well, we just have to like create this brand, we have to create this feeling. And, right. C-suite is like, show me the ROI. What role do you think that like brand and reputation and that part of the plays into things?
I think brand and reputation is extremely critical. And by the way, I don't think it's just the human nature of like, oh, we're status seeking monkeys and that's just some random fact about us. It is a reason we're status seeking monkeys. It's because status does confer in a scarce environment. There's a lot of these heuristics that like actually make sense that humans do. For example, like one of the rules of thumb, I call this the boundary gradient. People who are on the boundary and considering, should I join into this ecosystem or go to another one or just not join? Do they by default come in or do they fall out? And generally when you got a party going on, people will fall in because there's something going on. There's strength in numbers. A bunch of other people were probably seeing something I'm not seeing, but it's also fully rational because if you have you have two different things that you don't know which ones are viable, you don't know if either of them is viable. One of them has a bunch of people at it and one of them doesn't. All else equal, which one are you going to pick? I'm going to pick the one with a bunch of other people that independently made that decision. Secondarily, there is strength in numbers. The more thriving the ecosystem is, the less likely the thing is to get canceled, which will leave you out, somewhere, without help. The more likely there'll be open source projects that plug into it or work with it. The more likely that you go to Stack Overflow, you're going to have answers to your questions. So like, there's a very rational reason to join into ones that already have momentum. So, and I think brand to some degree is this overall earned credibility to some degree that leads to people being like, yeah, sure. Oh my gosh, I know that brand. I will like that. I trust that brand. And now I think marketing matters a lot for this, but I think we sometimes try to do it. We like try to fake it. We try to like, okay, I'm going to make this thing and I'm going to build this authentic brand. No, a brand is a mark that credibility accrues to over time that allows people like through people's iterative experiences with this. If people like it or net promoters, then it accrues to the brand and the brand becomes powerful. And now people will take the benefit of the doubt and prefer to go, oh my God, this one has that brand with it. Sure. But all else equal, I will go with that one. But you can't just make that up out of whole cloth. You got to earn the trust. You got to earn the credibility. So if you know that brand matters and you know that actions that there is a credibility store of like amount of like a stock, if you will, in a systems lens of credibility for your thing that is largely driven by people who actually use the product, like thinking it was so good that they would they think others should use it too. Then you can say, does this action that we're going to do increase the brand or decrease it? So I was just saw an interview of someone, the lead of The Economist, and she's talking about, typos erode credibility because they demonstrate that like they kind of puncture this view of us as, thoughtful and holistically understanding everything. So like typos, obsessing over typos is a tactic to have polish, which is kind of fits with can earn credibility, but it's a tactic. Sometimes the tactic is, I'm going to be really authentic. I'm going to have a podcast where I talk to a bunch of people and it's going to be me. And I'm going to, be very present as the CEO and founder in the message boards and very authentic about, you're right. That's a bug or a gap in our functionality. That I'd love to, just being real as opposed to like this, we're perfect. And we're going to,
it's almost like there's a continuum or a trade-off between, or a correlation rather, between accessibility and polish. So like the more accessible you are, the more it matters that you don't have
Mhm.
typos and things like that, because it shows
Mhm.
that you're like putting in time. It's a good signal. The less accessible you are, like people love that Elon Musk will just tweet something really quick and it doesn't have perfect grammar because it makes them feel like, or like people go on Joe Rogan and just talk in an off the cuff manner. It makes them feel like I'm just entering this guy's daily life stream of consciousness. He's not polishing anything or running it by legal or HR first. And that in that case, that's great. Some unknown person who has nobody begging for their time and is very accessible in general, just spewing out a bunch of badly, spelled stuff. It's not going to have the same effect, right?
Yeah.
The, the brand idea, I think, is just so interesting that you can't. It's like you can be conscious of it, but you can't fake it. It made me think of the handicap principle in nature, sort of the idea that animals with these handicaps, right, the extensive horns or feathers on a bird that make their life harder. It makes survival harder, but it makes them more fit mates. And you can't fake it, because if you're going to carry those, you actually have to keep surviving, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's an expensive correlated
killed.
signal, and it worked. Like, the other example, one of my favorite examples of the handicap principle is when gazelles are being chased by lions, the strong ones will prance up and down in place, and it's basically like saying, "Listen, if you chase after me, I will run so fast that you will for sure can't catch me. I'm so confident that I can waste energy right in front of you, just showing off, really."
Yep.
And so, like, go chase one of the other ones that's not good, isn't able to doing this. So, like, because it correlates with the underlying ability that is being tested for. Like, as a lion, will I be able to catch this one if I chase it? Is a really valuable signal. It's a very authentic and believable, credible signal. And
Yeah, I love, Alex, you said something. You said it's not just like, oh, humans are status seeking monkeys, as this sort of like nihilistic kind of like gotcha or some horrible thing that you pointed out. There's a reason to this. There's a function this serves. And that to me is such a important thing to, and this is where like just like rational choice theory or economic thinking comes in, because it's really easy to let ourselves off the hook by explaining behavior that seems bizarre by saying, well, that person's just crazy, or people are just shallow, people are just dumb, people are just lazy. And in products, I mean, I've experienced this myself. It's easy to be like, well, our product isn't succeeding because people are just lazy. Our customers are basically
it's
just,
their fault. It's not me.
right.
It's definitely that. Yeah.
And the thing is, this is where like a value neutral sort of approach to it, to say what they're doing is rational from their perspective. Rational does not equal morally good. It may or may not be that. Rational does not even equal that it's the most effective thing. But given the information and incentives they have, for some reason, they believe that acting this way is superior than acting this way. We got to understand, what is that reason? Let's get to the bottom of this. There's some function this is serving that we can't see.
This to me is one of the reasons I think that, especially in like in the tech world, I think there's like this notion of like compassion is for like losers, like heroes are going to just, get things done, don't have feelings, they just get shit done. And like, I think that's bullshit. I think compassion is strength. I think one of the reasons it's strength is precisely because compassion requires you to stick your neck out and say, to go in and try to inhabit someone else's mind space and see the world through their eyes and say, oh my God, wait a second, I totally get it now. Like, you're making this decision based on this trade-off that's invisible to me. And that allows you to be curious. It allows you to go and understand, like you said, like, oh man, these dummies, why aren't they doing this thing? It's like, maybe they aren't dummies. One of my favorite examples of one of these illusions, have you heard of this concept of ergodicity? Have we talked about, or maybe we talked about this, but.
Yes, I've heard the word, but I don't know it well enough to explain it, or I don't even know if I know it correctly. So
let me do my amateur, totally wrong description of it. It's like this. There's this ergodicity is a concept from physics, and it talks about absorbing barriers, game over conditions. And it turns out that a lot of our probability in statistics and financial modeling and economics rely on a probability distributions. But probability distributions assume independent trials. And so if you have 12 different people doing a thing at one time, yeah, sure, over time, those are all independent. Over time, you expect a certain, percentage of each to have some outcome. But if you take one individual over time, it looks basically the same. There's 12 different things. And each one is kind of independent, like a dice roll each time, but it's not, because that person can die. So if that person goes bankrupt, they don't exist in time step, they stop existing in time step 2, they don't exist in time step 6. And this wildly changes the math and is one of the reasons that people fear downside, prospect theory. And one of the reasons is because you can die, like you can be game over. And so nothing else matters. And so people are naturally risk averse to some degree, somewhat intentionally. So like, I remember in college, there was like people are so irrational. They would rather take $40 today than $80 in 3 months. And it's like, that's not irrational. Like, they don't know if they're going to live here. They don't know if they're going to be able to find you. They don't know if it's going to be some weird thing. Like they can take the money right now. It's for sure going to work. Or they can just say like, maybe they're going to tell them they have 15 minutes in this weird window and they have to get an appointment. And it's not like, it's like, just take it, man. You don't know what's going to happen. That's rational. And I think and so this also reminds me of the Monty Hall problem, where this genius was describing why you should switch after the I want to unpack that whole thing, so maybe we shouldn't go down that path. But
is the Monty Hall one where you have something behind a door, you have a behind 3 doors and there's a car and there's a goat or something? I'm piecing it together.
So I'll just explain. So
go ahead.
It's an old game show apparently, and there was 3 doors, and behind 2 of them is a goat and one of them is a car. So 2 losers, 1 winner. And the player picks one of the doors, and then the host, Monty Hall, will reveal one of the goats and say, do you want to switch your answer? And the answer is you do. Like naive, like when you're applying normal probability approaches and stuff, the answer is no, it's still the same distribution and nothing changed, so you should stay with it. But you actually should change. And there was someone in the 80s, I don't know her, Von Sant, I think was her last name, had a column where she said, yes, you should switch. And basically tons of like statisticians were like, let me explain to you. Listen here, lady, here's how it actually works. And here's why you're wrong. And she was 100% correct. And if you play out this, if you experiment with it, you actually play the game, within like 10 rounds, the intuition will smack you in the face. It's so obvious why you had to switch. It's just very hard to articulate using the tools of statistics, which lead you astray. In the same way, we'll get these things where like people are being irrational. Maybe our tools are wrong. Maybe the way we're modeling actually the trade-offs that they're making are not accounting for a really relevant thing. And you ask the individual people why they're making the decisions they're making, and they can't tell you. But there was like a heuristic. It's like, I just think I should take this one. I don't really know why, but this one feels safer. And just assuming that they're right, assuming that they actually are modeling. No, not all the time. To your point, this is not to say it's a moral choice for them. It might be a very immoral choice that they're making, but
no, and like just the more you understand the context that people are making these decisions in, the more you can start to see this. This is very applicable actually to some of the things we talk about. That a lot of people working in the partnership space talk about, because creating value for someone. So this idea that like, okay, you create value for someone with some kind of offer, right? You're going to give them something, and then it's going to make them, want to reciprocate, whatever. It can go wrong in so many ways if you're ignorant of the context. This is why like let's say you're a B2B SaaS company and you send out some kind of email that's like, hey, we want you to fill out a survey. And so in response, we'll give you a $5 gift card. That's not gonna do any, right? It's almost like I like to use the analogy, if like my best friend says, hey, I'm moving, will you come help me move on Saturday? And I'm like, yeah. If he said, hey, if you help me move on Saturday, I'll give you $20, I would be less likely. I'd be offended.
Yeah, exactly. I'd be like, what the hell, man? I know you. Like, I'm doing this because I care about this relationship and like the commitment that we've done and like the credibility and trust that we've earned in one another. And like, you're going to sit here and cheapen it with this transactional thing. Yeah. Like,
because sometimes giving someone the opportunity to do you a favor actually creates more value for them, right?
100%.
And making a transaction.
I think LBJ did this. Is one of the weird tricks I picked up at some point, is like asking specific people to do favors when you are in an authentic, trusting, non-transactional kind of looking out for one another kind of relationship. It does bring people closer, and you have to be really careful, because some of these tools, a lot of these tricks, by the way, tactics, are amoral, which is to say they can be used for good and they can be used for ill. Yep. And of course, everybody always sticks to the hero. There are things that they are the one making the right call. So you have to really challenge yourself at all times to look from the outside perspective and say, someone were to play me a clip of this decision 5 years from now or 10 years from now, would I be proud of this, or like at least okay with it? Or would I be like, oh, geez, I can't believe, that's embarrassing. Like, so I try to like live my life thinking about how 10 years in the future will look back and be like, and how I'll feel about my decisions in that moment. And that,
that's funny. I was going to ask, because it was one of the things near the end of your gardening platform thing here, you said something about like what will be true in 10 years, or there was some 10-year question in there that related to that, and kind of deciding whether and to what extent you invest in something like this. I think that's like that time horizon, because it's easy to kind of make these decisions or form strategies with this sort of like indefinite or undefined time horizon. And that can radically change. Like you said, get the product market fit first. Okay. So don't be worrying about that but once you have it, now extend that time horizon. Like what's going to be true of the world in 10 years that if I can get out in front of it now, okay. We only have a few minutes here and I'm going to be super quick, but I feel like
can I just say one thing on that real quick? Sorry, I think my general rule of thumb is the longer the time horizon that you can incorporate into your thinking properly, because again, you have to focus on surviving to get to the point where like you actually do have a long time horizon. Once you have it, the longer it is, the more moral you can be and the more indirect, more value maximizing you can be, because you can think about and incorporate all the indirect effects. So my general rule of thumb is the longer term your perspective can be, the better choices you will make for society and for yourself generally. So like I believe that, but again, survival, like the short term is survival, but it's a means to an end. The end is all the indirect stuff that you do, all the infinite game style stuff that you're able to accomplish and make the world a better place, I think.
Oh my gosh. We're touching on like all kinds of game theory. We could go all over the place. This is too much fun. So I got to ask you before we go though, you have another presentation that is super, super popular on slime molds. Is essentially sort of like, hey, as an organization grows in size, the complexity increases, and there's this tendency, like really hard to get things done. You get kind of bureaucratic, and you say that this like using the slime mold as an analogy is kind of the best way to deal with these inevitable problems. Can you give us the 2-minute, give us the elevator pitch on this?
So the elevator pitch is, first of all, it's told in emoji flipbook style, which it was as an aesthetic choice I kind of tripped across, and like turns out to really work for that kind of argument. And the broader point is, everybody who's been in any organization ever knows that organizations that once were successful and fast moving and able to do a bunch of stuff, over time as they grow, it's just almost impossible to get anything done. And this effect arises fundamentally based on size of number of people interacting on a project in a fundamental, like probabilistic way. Like it's an inescapable force of gravity that's hidden, that we all kind of ignore and pretend doesn't exist, which makes us all feel frankly kind of gaslit and working really, really hard and accomplishing quite a bit less. And the answer, the way that you address these things, are almost exactly the exact opposite of what people think. So people think, okay, I got to be more heroic. I got to throw more coordination spreadsheets into it. And like, no, that's not how that works. Like you need to pull back. You need to create a little bit more slack. You have to be okay with something being good enough for now and then on a path to eventual convergence. People say, oh, we should break down boundaries and silos. Actually, boundaries and silos are precisely the answer to how you address some of these things. Just make sure that the individual things are talking to each other well enough that they can be independent and autonomous, and yet also on a path to convergence and in a path to sort of coherence. So people have told me they have cried reading that deck, and in that, because it's part of my point is I want to reach out and give everyone a hug and say, you are not crazy. Like this is a real
to their
thing,
trauma,
right? And I think it's funny. I wrote this an original version of this a number of years ago. I recreated it, and it's different. I did it from memory, so I'm sure it's different in some ways. But the story beats kind of, once you have the story beats, like the emojis fall into place. There's not really that many choices at any given story beat. But it's funny, over the years now, it shows up in all these contexts. People reach out to me and be in wildly different contexts and church groups and large government bureaucracies and startups, and they'll say, this really spoke to me. And people will come to me and they'll be like, yeah, this really spoke to me. It's affecting our company. It's like, cool. How big is your company? They'll be 5 people. And it's like, what? I thought it was physically impossible for it to show up in that small of an environment. But I think it is a fundamental characteristic. It is like the fundamental curse of human existence, of like a coordination problem. If only everybody could just go in the same direction, where we wouldn't have these problems. And it's a curse. And you got to embrace it, acknowledge that it exists, as opposed to pretending it doesn't exist, because it will run you over.
I love that you said, like, instead of gaslighting, just acknowledge what you are and what's true and try to work with that. It reminds me of, you'll hear sometimes like, oh, well, this is, everybody's back channeling instead of doing the official proper channels. And rather than trying to like shut down back channeling, like, okay, cool, good. How can we make that easier? Or everybody's making things in their own spreadsheets instead of using the more robust software that we have for this purpose. it's like, well, what is it? How can we tap into the power of those spreadsheets, right? There's something that's happening there that people, they feel the need to move to the margins, to move outside of the central system for certain activities. We need to let them do that and somehow allow that to kind of be, you know what I mean? It's just, I don't know. There's something there about acknowledging what you are instead of pretending to be something else. And again, this kind of comes back to where so many companies, at least in their pitch decks, will be like, we are a platform with network effects, when it's like, no, you're just a really good product for a really certain,
Yeah. And you hope to be, because there's compounding effects, but I don't see it yet. Like, I'm not seeing I think you're right. Like, there's people think that acknowledging some of these, like these forces of gravity is like, oh, it's such a bummer. What a nihilist perspective. What? I think it's actually a very empowered perspective. I think it's once you acknowledge the forces that are on, like, once you acknowledge it, if you think your adjacent possible is like this, and you say, actually, your adjacent possible is like this, kind of a bummer. It feels like being a nihilist or whatever. But then you realize I do truly have agency within this adjacent possible. The actions I pick matter. And if you do it, then you're in another adjacent possible, and you can go and you can arc to wildly better outcomes by acknowledging these constraints. So like, if you try to fight them, you will lose. Like, you will not win, because you can't fight the force of gravity and win. It's just not possible. I'm sorry. But once you acknowledge that, you can do all kinds of clever stuff. And so it's the path to it's funny, but oh man, you're such a nihilist. What? I consider the exact opposite, actually.
Yeah. Trying to build a flimsy seawall when the wave is inevitable, instead of trying to build a surfboard, Alex, this has been an absolute blast. Give us like a Flux Collective. Who should check it out? What's it all about?
Everybody. I mean, I think it's great. It's a community. I'm a part of a bunch of amazing, fascinating, interesting, different perspectives, weird, interesting, thought-provoking ideas. And we publish a newsletter every Thursday afternoon. And I just think, honestly, our point is that basically anyone who would read it would find at least one thing they go, oh, huh, in it each week is part of the point.
I have definitely pulled tidbits from there and put them into the Partner Hacker Daily email. So thank you so much. And until next time, Partner Up.